Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
It's great to be here.
I want you to just, for a second, picture a scenario. It sounds like something out of a novel, a real psychological thriller, but it is 100% historical. You have a man. For 30 years, he wears the robes of a Catholic priest. He's at the altar every single Sunday, preaching Mass, baptizing newborn children, comforting the dying in their final moments.
He is the pillar of his community.
The absolute pillar. Outwardly, he's pious, he's austere, incredibly charitable, just the perfect model of a holy man.
Jean Meslier.
Exactly, Jean Meslier. But then he dies. And the moment he's gone, his parishioners, the people he served for 3 decades, they find a letter.
And it's not just a note.
No, not at all. It's a massive 300-page manuscript, a testament, and it's addressed directly to them.
And what's inside just shatters everything.
It's a confession. He tells them that for all 30 of those years, he believed absolutely none of it. He declares that God does not exist, that religion is nothing more than a political trap to keep people down, and that he is dying with this immense feeling of relief because he can finally speak the truth.
An unbelievable bombshell to drop from beyond the grave.
So today, we're diving into the explosive writings of this 18th century priest. His posthumous work, Superstition in All Ages, became really a foundational text for atheism, and maybe the most shocking critique of God ever written by a man of the cloth.
It's just a remarkable story. You have the ultimate insider. I mean, this is an agent of the church.
Right.
And he's secretly working as a kind of sleeper agent for the Enlightenment, writing this manual to destroy the very institution that feeds him.
The tension is what gets me, the cognitive dissonance of it all. Imagine every time he raised the host during the Eucharist, this is my body.
He's screaming inside.
He must be. Every time he absolved the sin he didn't believe in. Why? Why would anyone live that lie for so long?
Well, that's the central tragedy of Meslier's life, isn't it? He wasn't a hypocrite in the sense that he was, enjoying the perks of power while secretly laughing at his flock.
He wasn't getting rich.
No, far from it. He was trapped. You'd have to remember, this is the late 17th, early 18th century. There wasn't a secular option for an educated but poor man. The church was pretty much your only path to a life of the mind.
So let's ground this in his actual life. Who was Jean Meslier before he became this secret iconoclast?
He was born in 1678 in Mazarin, which is in the Champagne region of France. His background was humble. His father was a serge weaver.
And that's important, you think?
I think it's crucial. Meslier never forgot where he came from. He wasn't some aristocrat playing with philosophy in a salon. He was a man of the people, and he saw their suffering firsthand.
So he goes to the seminary, which is the path forward for him, and it's there that he runs into the philosophy of Descartes. Now, for anyone listening who maybe hasn't brushed up on their 17th century philosophy, why is Descartes so significant here?
Well, Descartes is famous for his method of radical doubt. I think, therefore I am.
Doubt everything until you find something you can't possibly doubt.
Exactly. And Descartes himself was a devout Christian, but his method, it's a dangerous tool if it falls into the wrong hands. It seems Meslier learned the method of doubt, but he didn't stop where Descartes did.
He kept going.
He kept doubting right past the existence of God.
So after seminary, he gets his parish. He becomes the curate of Étrepigny. And by all accounts, we have Voltaire's biography as a source for this, he was an incredibly virtuous priest. This wasn't a case of a bad priest who broke the rules and then got bitter.
No, and that's what makes his testimony so powerful. If he'd been, a drinker or a gambler or a womanizer,
the church could have just dismissed him. Oh, he's just a sinner trying to justify his vice.
Precisely. But Meslier was rigid. He was incredibly charitable. The sources say he gave all of his excess salary to the poor of his parish. He lived the Christian ideal better than most of the actual believers did.
Which makes his critique so much more devastating, doesn't it? It's like he's saying, I am a good person not because of God, but in spite of this whole system.
Exactly. But there were cracks in the facade. There's this one incident that gives us a real window into the rage he must have been suppressing. It involves the local lord of the village, a man called the Sieur de Touy.
Oh, this story is incredible. It really shows that his atheism wasn't just some abstract philosophical game. It was rooted in a fierce sense of justice. So what happened?
Okay, so you have to picture the feudal system. The lord of the manor and the village priest are the two pillars of authority. They're supposed to support each other.
Keep the peasants in line.
Right. But this Sieur de Touy had apparently been mistreating the peasants, probably overtaxing them, maybe abusing his hunting rights on their land. the usual petty tyranny, and Meslier was furious.
And normally a priest in that position would just have to look the other way, right? You don't bite the hand that feeds the entire social order.
You'd think so. But one Sunday, the Sieur de Tuy is sitting in his place of honor, the front pew, and when it comes time for the parish prayers, Meslier refuses to include him.
Just omits his name.
He publicly snubs him. In a tiny village like that, this is a nuclear explosion of scandal. It's a direct challenge to the entire social hierarchy.
So the Lord complains.
Of course.
Yeah.
He goes straight to the bishop. Because if the priest can disrespect the Lord, well, the peasants might start getting some dangerous ideas.
Right. It's that connection we'll get into later between religion and political control.
Exactly. So the bishop orders Meslier to apologize publicly. He has no choice. So the next Sunday, Meslier gets up in the pulpit.
Yeah.
The Lord is there in the front row, just beaming, expecting his public apology to restore his honor.
And Meslier just completely flips the script on him.
He does. He says something like, "I have been ordered to pray for the Sieur de Tuy. So let us pray to God that he may convert the heart of our Lord and grant him the grace not to mistreat the poor and despoil the orphans of this parish."
Wow. That's not an apology. That's a second accusation wrapped in the language of prayer.
It's an absolute masterclass in passive aggression. But it shows his character. He hated the pious lies he was forced to tell, but he hated injustice even more. He saw the church not just as being wrong about God, but as being an active accomplice to these tyrants.
And he carries this anger, this secret, for 30 years until his death in 1733. And the sources suggest he might have actually starved himself to death.
It's widely believed that, just disgusted with the world and his part in it, he refused food at the end, a kind of slow, deliberate suicide. But before he died, he made absolutely sure his voice would survive. He left 3 identical handwritten copies of his testament.
And on the envelope, that message to his parishioners, I mean, it's just so haunting. "I have seen and recognized the errors. I did not dare say it during my life, but I will say it at least in dying."
He wanted his death to be the witness that his life could never be.
But that does bring up a hard question, and it's one Meslier himself anticipates. Was he a coward? I mean, he waits until he's safely in the coffin to drop this bomb. Why didn't he just speak up sooner?
It's a completely fair question, but we have to remember the stakes. This is 1730s France. Openly professing atheism was a capital offense.
You could be burned.
You could be imprisoned in the Bastille, tortured, burned at the stake. This was not a theoretical danger, and Meslier writes about this. He says it wasn't just a simple fear, but, and this is his phrase, a fear superior to strength.
A fear superior to strength. That's a very human, very powerful admission.
It is. He writes about how much he suffered internally, having to preach what he called pious lies. He saw himself as a captive, and this testament was his act of restitution. He felt he had defrauded his parishioners for 3 decades, and this truth was the only repayment he could possibly offer.
Okay, so let's finally open this testament. Because it's not just a rant. It is a systematic, logical deconstruction of the entire worldview of his time. And he starts with the biggest target of all, the nature of theology itself.
He does, and he gives a definition of theology that I think is one of the most brutal and cutting descriptions ever written. He calls theology the ignorance of natural causes reduced to a system.
That is a heavy phrase. Let's unpack that a little.
Right.
Ignorance reduced to a system.
Right. Think about how we normally treat ignorance. It's usually just a gap, right? I don't know what causes lightning. But Meslier's point is that theology takes that gap, that I don't know, and it builds an elaborate, complex system of rules inside of it.
It turns I don't know into I know, and here's a 1,000-page book about the guy who's angry and throwing lightning bolts.
Exactly. By labeling the unknown as God, you're not actually explaining anything. You're just giving your ignorance a name. And once you do that, you stop investigating. You stop looking for electricity or atmospheric pressure because you think you already have the answer.
So theology, in his view, is actually an obstacle to real knowledge because it masquerades as the final answer.
Precisely. He uses this fantastic analogy to illustrate the point. The barbarian and the watch.
Yes, I love this. It really clarifies what he's getting at.
It's a classic Enlightenment image. He asks us to imagine a man from a culture that has never seen any kind of machinery. He uses the term barbarian, which was common for the time.
Look.
This man finds a pocket watch. He hears it ticking. He sees the hands moving in a regular, ordered way.
But he can't open the back. He can't see the gears, the spring, the mechanics of it.
Right. So because he has no knowledge of mechanics, what does he conclude? He concludes there must be a spirit inside the watch, a little ghost pushing the hands around.
It's the only explanation that makes sense based on his limited knowledge. It moves, so it must be alive or possessed in some way.
And Meslier says this is exactly what theologians do with the universe. They see the sun move, they see the seasons change, they see bodies function. They don't understand the gears, the laws of physics, biology, chemistry, so they just say a great spirit is moving it all.
So the word God is just what we call the spirit of the watch when we don't understand how the universe actually works.
That's his point, exactly. He says that saying God is a spirit is actually saying nothing at all. It's just a placeholder for, I don't know.
He also goes after the internal logic of this God. Theologians, he points out, love to say that God is incomprehensible. God works in mysterious ways. His mind is not our mind.
It's the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card for any religious argument.
But Meslier spots a huge logical paradox there. If God is truly and fundamentally incomprehensible, if he's infinite and we are finite, then there can be no relationship between us.
This is a devastating point. If X is infinite and Y is finite, there's no ratio. There's no common ground. Meslier argues that an incomprehensible God is, by definition, completely useless to humanity.
Because you can't know his will, you can't know his nature, you can't possibly know how to please him because you can't understand him in the first place.
Yes. And yet, as Meslier points out with great sarcasm, the priests spend their entire lives telling you exactly what this incomprehensible being wants.
Right. He's incomprehensible, but I can tell you he absolutely does not want you to eat meat on a Friday.
Frockles. Yes, he becomes very comprehensible when it involves obedience or, more importantly, money. Meslier just hammers this hypocrisy. You can't have it both ways. He can't be a mystery beyond all human thought and a petty micromanager of human diet and behavior.
And speaking of attributes, he just systematically dismantles the idea of God's perfection. He lists all these contradictions that we just sort of accept without thinking. For example, God is supposed to be immutable, unchanging.
But the Bible is just filled with stories of God getting angry, then changing his mind, then regretting that he even made humanity, then deciding to save them after all. Meslier asks a simple question. How can an immutable being have mood swings?
It's a great point. If he changes his mind because I prayed, he's not immutable. And if he doesn't change his mind, then why am I praying?
It's a perfect logical trap. But where the text gets really heated, where you can feel Meslier's rage as a prosecutor, is when he tackles the attribute of infinite goodness.
The problem of evil.
Yes. This is, of course, the oldest argument against the existence of God, but Meslier gives it a ferocity that is just. It's raw. You have to remember, he was a parish priest. He buried children who died of starvation. He saw peasants broken by endless labor. He saw suffering up close every single day.
And he makes a very bold claim. He says if God is infinitely good, he owes happiness to his creatures. That's a strong word. Owes. God owes us something.
His argument is that creation is a choice. If you, as a creator, choose to bring a being into existence, and you have the power to make that being happy, and you instead create a world where that being is almost guaranteed to be miserable, you are not good. You are cruel.
He uses the workman analogy to drive this home.
He does. He says, look at the world as a machine. It's a machine that has earthquakes, diseases, hurricanes, droughts. It's constantly breaking and hurting, even killing the people who live inside it. Now, he says, if a human workman built a house that collapsed on its tenants, or a ship that sank on its first voyage, what would we call him?
A terrible workman. Incompetent or maybe even malicious.
Exactly. A bad mechanic. But Meslier says theologians look at this broken, painful, disordered world and they call the workman perfect. He says this is just madness. It's a complete denial of the evidence right in front of our faces.
And this leads to what I think is maybe the most powerful and disturbing image in the entire book. It's the trapdoor analogy.
Yeah.
This is where he absolutely dismantles the idea of divine providence.
This image, it really stays with you. Meslier asks us to imagine a father. He has children, and they're playing in a room. But the father isn't in the room with them. He's hiding.
Okay.
He's watching them through a trapdoor in the ceiling or a hidden window. He can see everything they do.
Right.
And he watches as his children play. He sees them stumble. He sees them falling toward a cliff or a fire. He sees them picking up dangerous objects to hurt each other. Now, this father has the absolute power to intervene. He could shout a warning. He could rush into the room. He could stop it all.
But he doesn't.
He stays silent. hidden behind the trapdoor. He just watches as they break their bones, as they hurt each other, as they fall. And then, and this is the real kicker, after they have fallen and hurt themselves, he comes out from his hiding place and viciously punishes them for falling.
That's horrific.
It's a monstrous image. And Meslier asks, what would we think of a human father who did this? We would call him a monster. We would lock him up. And yet this is precisely the relationship that Christianity describes between God and humanity.
He watches us sin, he watches us suffer, he does nothing to stop it, and then he punishes us with eternal hell for the mistakes he allowed us to make.
It takes the abstract mystery of God's will and it makes it so visceral. It makes God seem not just absent, but actively, sadistically cruel.
And for Meslier, this was really the final nail in the coffin for his faith. He just could not reconcile the suffering he saw in his village every day with this idea of a good father. He concluded the good father must be a lie.
So if there's no good father, no providence, no master plan, what are we left with? How does Meslier explain the universe if he takes the creator out of the equation?
This is where he gets really radical for his time. He pivots to a purely materialist philosophy.
Yes. He argues that we don't need a god to explain the universe. His key phrase is, matter acts of itself.
Matter acts of itself. That's a revolutionary thought for 1729.
It's completely radical. He's essentially arguing that motion is an inherent property of matter. Nature follows necessary internal laws. Atoms move, they combine, they separate. We don't need a spirit to push them around from the outside.
But the classic religious counterargument to that is always, but look at the order. Look at the stars in their courses, the changing of the seasons. It's so beautifully organized, someone must have designed it.
And Meslier tackles this head-on. He says that what we call order is just our own subjective experience. It's a human projection.
What do you mean?
Well, we call it order when the sun's movement gives us a warm day for our crops. We call it disorder when that same sun's movement creates a drought that kills them. But to the universe, to matter itself, it's all just the same process. The sun doesn't care about our crops.
This brings us to another one of his great analogies, the ants in the garden. This one is all about human arrogance, isn't it?
It's a perfect takedown of anthropocentrism. He asks us to imagine a colony of ants living in the gardens of Versailles, at the time the most magnificent, manicured, designed gardens in the world, built for the King of France.
Okay.
Now imagine those ants gathering and having a little philosophical discussion. They say, look at these perfectly arranged flowers, look at these beautiful fountains. Clearly a great gardener built all of this just for us ants. He must love us very much.
But of course, the gardener doesn't even know the ants are there. He might crush their entire colony with his boot without even noticing.
Exactly. And Meslier says we are the ants. We look at this vast, violent, utterly indifferent universe, and we tell ourselves a story that it was all made for us. He sees it as a kind of psychological coping mechanism. We can't handle the idea that we're cosmically insignificant, so we invent a story where we're the main character.
That's a profoundly humbling perspective. It just strips away that warm, fuzzy, human-centric security blanket.
It does. And once you strip that away, you're forced to ask the next logical question. If this is all just a story we tell ourselves, why did we start telling it in the first place?
Yeah.
Where did religion actually come from?
And Meslier has a very specific and not very flattering answer. It boils down to two things: fear and politics.
He identifies ignorance and fear as the two pivots of all religion. He tries to reconstruct the psychology of the first believers. Imagine early humanity. They're surrounded by terrifying forces they can't control or understand: storms, floods, diseases, sudden death.
They're constantly afraid.
And the human mind absolutely hates a vacuum. We need an explanation for things. So if the thunderclap scares you and you have no idea what thunder is, you assume it's a giant in the sky shouting at you. You project a human-like personality onto the forces of nature.
So religion starts as a kind of panic response to the unknown.
Yes, and then it becomes a habit. And this is where he makes a point that sociologists still make today. Religion is largely a matter of geography. He says a man is a Christian because he was born in France. If he'd been born in Turkey, he'd be a Muslim. If he'd been born in Asia, a Buddhist or a Hindu.
He calls belief a habit of childhood.
That's the phrase. And he has a great analogy for priests. He compares them to nurses who tell children ghost stories to keep them quiet or make them go to sleep.
Don't go into the dark woods or the goblin will get you.
Exactly. He says priests do the same thing, but to adults. They tell stories of hell and divine judgment to keep the general population in line.
And this is where we get to the political conspiracy part of his argument. This is one of Meslier's most radical claims. He doesn't just think religion is a mistake. He thinks it's a deliberately crafted tool of tyranny.
This is the prince and the executioner concept. Meslier argues that there is an unholy symbiotic alliance between the altar and the throne, between the priest and the king.
We've seen this play out throughout history, but how specifically did Meslier see it working in his own time in France?
Well, think about the official doctrine of the French monarchy at the time, the divine right of kings. The king isn't just a guy with a bigger army. He is God's chosen, anointed representative on earth.
So if you rebel against the king, you're not just a traitor to the state.
You're a heretic. You're a sinner against God himself. It turns political dissent into a theological crime. It is the ultimate security system for a tyrant. The priest stands up in the pulpit and tells the peasant, "Suffer your miserable life in silence, obey your master without question, and you will be rewarded in heaven."
It's a social sedative. It pacifies the population and prevents revolution.
Meslier says it makes people cowardly slaves. It teaches them to accept injustice on earth by promising them a fantasy reward in the afterlife. He quotes a court jester who supposedly said, "The only true faith is the one which is on the side of the prince and the executioner."
Wow. Meaning religion is just the PR department for the state's monopoly on violence.
That was a very cynical, but as Meslier saw it, a very accurate observation. And you have to remember, he was part of this machine. He was the one standing in the pulpit, reading the king's decrees, telling the peasants to obey. He saw himself as a cog in this vast machine of oppression, and it clearly ate him alive inside.
Now, since Meslier was a Catholic priest, he doesn't just attack religion in general. He goes specifically and viciously after Christianity. And I mean, he pulls no punches. I want to talk about his critique of the central Christian figure, the man-God.
He finds the core dogmas of Christianity to be not just wrong, but logically absurd. He goes after the Trinity, the idea that 1 equals 3 and 3 equals 1. He basically dismisses it as metaphysical nonsense math. But he saves his greatest scorn for the sacrament of the Eucharist.
The God bread, as he calls it.
Yes, the doctrine of transubstantiation. The idea that the omnipotent creator of the entire universe literally turns himself into a piece of bread.
So you can be eaten.
Eaten, digested, and, well, eventually excreted by human beings. Meslier finds this idea just profoundly disgusting and ridiculous. He calls the God bread the fetish of the Christian nations.
And again, you just have to imagine him performing this ritual every single week, holding up that wafer, saying the words, "This is my body," while thinking to himself, this is just a piece of dough, and we are all collectively insane.
It's a complete theater of the absurd from his perspective. He also attacks the character of Jesus as portrayed in the Gospels. He doesn't see the gentle teacher that many people see. He portrays Jesus as a kind of fanatic.
A fanatic in what way?
Well, he points to the fact that Jesus seemed to preach the imminent end of the world. He said, "Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened."
Right, but that generation did pass away, and the world didn't end.
So to Meslier, Jesus was, at best, a failed apocalyptic prophet, a man who died miserably for a cause that never materialized, and whose promises like, "Seek and you shall find, ask and it will be given," are disproven by the daily experience of every suffering person on the planet.
He sees the starving peasants in his own village who pray and seek and ask and find nothing but continued hunger.
So for him, the promises of the Gospels are empirically, demonstrably false. It's just a brutal critique because it comes from someone who knows the texts inside and out.
But this leads to what is, for many people, a terrifying thought. If you take away God, if you take away the thread of hell and the promise of heaven, what happens to morality?
This is the panic button for the religious mind, isn't it? The idea that if God is dead, everything is permitted. Without a celestial policeman watching over us, won't we all just start murdering and stealing from each other?
It's an argument you still hear all the time today. But Meslier completely flips this on its head. He argues that atheists can be, and in fact often are, more moral than religious believers.
He does. He makes a comparison between the fear of man and the fear of God. Think about how religious forgiveness is supposed to work. If a religious person commits a crime, they believe they can repent. They can go to confession, say a few prayers, and poof, the slate is wiped clean with God.
It's a moral loophole. I can sin now and just apologize to God for it later.
Exactly. But what about the atheist? The atheist knows there is no supernatural pardon waiting for them. They know that they have to answer to their neighbors, to the laws of society, and to their own reputation right here in this world.
So their sense of accountability is immediate and tangible, not deferred to some future judgment.
Meslier argues that the fear of the hangman, and just as importantly, the desire to be loved and respected by your community, are much stronger and more reliable motivators for good behavior than the fear of an invisible hell that might not even exist. He says honor is a stronger bond than piety.
He also talks about something he calls social utility. I found this really interesting because it sounds very modern. He seems to be arguing that morality should be measured by how useful an action is to society.
Yes. He has a lot of contempt for the traditional religious ideal of the saint or the monk. You know, the hermit who goes out into the desert, prays all day, fasts, wears a hair shirt, and completely isolates himself from humanity. The church holds this person up as the pinnacle of virtue.
But Meslier asks a very practical question. What good is he actually doing?
Right. Is he growing food for the hungry? Is he teaching children to read? Is he building houses for the homeless? No. Meslier calls this kind of virtue completely useless. He argues that true morality is about contributing to the common good. It's about justice, kindness, and productive labor.
So in his view, a good farmer who works hard and treats his neighbors with fairness is infinitely more moral than a monk who prays for 12 hours a day but contributes nothing tangible to society.
Precisely. It's a radical shift from what you could call ritual morality. Actions designed to please a hidden god to social morality, actions designed to help actual human beings. He advises kings to stop meddling in theology and start governing based on reason and equity. His message is basically, leave the gods in peace and take care of your people.
Leave the gods in peace. That's a powerful slogan. It's basically a plea for secular humanism, centuries before the term even existed.
It really is. He's trying to build a foundation for ethics that doesn't rely on what he sees as a myth. Because if your entire system of morality relies on a myth and then that myth collapses, your morality collapses with it. Meslier wants a morality that can stand on its own 2 feet.
So Meslier dies in 1733. He leaves these 3 handwritten copies of his testament. He's gone. What happens to the book? Does it just get buried with him?
No, and this is where the story turns into a kind of Enlightenment-era thriller. The manuscripts were incredibly dangerous contraband. You couldn't just walk into a print shop in Paris and say, I'd like to publish this book arguing that God doesn't exist and the king is a tyrant.
That's burn at the stake material for both you and the printer.
Absolutely. But they started to circulate in the intellectual underground. Professional scribes would be hired to make more hand copies. And they were sold on the black market in Paris for as much as 10 louis d'or.
Which was a massive amount of money back then.
A fortune. It just shows how hungry people were for this kind of forbidden thought. The intelligentsia of Paris were passing these manuscripts around like secret treasures.
And eventually, a copy falls into the hands of the most famous and perhaps most influential man in all of Europe at the time, Voltaire.
Yes. Voltaire gets a copy, and he is absolutely floored. He writes letters to his friends saying things like, have you read the testament of the Curé Meslier? It makes one tremble.
He's just shocked that a simple country priest could have written something so radical.
He is. But here's the twist. Voltaire had his own agenda. Voltaire was not an atheist. He was a deist.
Okay, let's just quickly remind everyone of that distinction.
A deist believes in a creator god, a kind of divine clockmaker who set the universe in motion and then stepped back. But they don't believe in the organized church, in miracles, or in divine revelation. It's a philosopher's god.
Whereas Meslier was a full-blown atheist. He didn't believe in the clockmaker at all. For him, the clock just wound itself. Matter moves itself.
Exactly. So Voltaire finds this text, and he loves all the savage attacks on the church, on the priests, on the Bible. But he's not so keen on the no God at all part.
So what does he do?
He does something a little bit shady by modern standards. He publishes an abstract of Meslier's work. He edits it heavily. He polishes up the style. He famously called Meslier's original prose a bit rough, like a carriage horse. But he softened the philosophy.
He censored the raw atheism.
He curated it. He kept all the juicy bits attacking the priests, the miracles, the political tyranny, but he cut out most of the sections where Meslier argues for strict materialism. He essentially tried to turn Meslier the atheist into Meslier the deist, like himself.
So he used the priest as a powerful weapon against the church, but he tried to blunt the weapon a little so it wouldn't kill God entirely.
That's a perfect way to put it. But even with Voltaire's edits, the impact was massive. It was a huge scandal. The very idea that a man from inside the system, a man of God, had secretly penned the most vicious critique of that system imaginable. It just shook the foundations of the church's authority.
It validates every suspicion that critics ever had. It's like finding out the CEO of a cigarette company left a secret diary saying, "I know this stuff kills people and I hate myself for selling it every day."
That is a perfect modern analogy. It completely destroys the moral high ground of the institution from the inside out.
And later on, in the 19th century, the full, unedited text was finally published, Atheism and All. And Meslier took his rightful place as a true pioneer of this kind of thought.
Yes. He's really considered the first person in modern Western history to write a complete, systematic, uncompromising defense of atheism. Before him, people might have hinted at it or whispered it in private. Meslier wrote it all down and shouted it from the grave.
So we've unpacked the man, his life, the theology, the politics, the morality. It's a lot to digest, but I want to bring this back to us here today. Why does this angry 18th century priest still matter to a listener in the 21st century?
I think Meslier challenges us to do something that is actually very difficult, and that is to separate truth from habit. He constantly, relentlessly points out that we believe most of what we believe because we were told it as children, not because we've rigorously examined the evidence for ourselves.
That phrase, the habit of childhood, it just sticks with you.
It forces you to ask, how many of my core beliefs about politics, about society, about the nature of reality are just accidents of geography? Are they just stories my nurse told me to keep me quiet?
And he also forces us to confront that uncomfortable connection between belief and power.
Yes. To ask the question, who benefits from what you believe? Does your belief system empower you and encourage you to fix the world's problems? Or does it make you, in his words, a cowardly slave, just patiently waiting for a reward in some other life?
If there's no good father hiding behind a trap door waiting to catch us, then we have to be the ones to catch each other.
Exactly. There's a terrifying freedom in his message, but it's also incredibly liberating. The relief of facing the universe as it really is, raw, indifferent, material, and deciding that it's up to us to create meaning and justice and compassion rather than waiting for a silent God to do it for us.
Which brings us to a final thought from the source material that I'd like to leave everyone with. Meslier suggests that if God is truly infinite and incomprehensible, and if all of our human definitions of him are just filled with contradictions and confusion, then maybe the most rational, the most respectful thing we can do for the infinite is to just stop thinking about him entirely.
To stop arguing about it, stop persecuting each other over it, stop wasting so much time and energy on the unknowable.
Exactly. And instead, focus all of that energy on fixing the very real, very tangible world that's right here in front of us. Perhaps silence is the only true form of worship.
It's a profound thought. If the universe is silent, maybe we should stop shouting at it and start talking to each other instead.
A powerful place to end. Jean Meslier, the atheist priest who spoke from the grave to try and wake us up. Thanks for thinking deeper with us.